have a super fascinating, hopefully, topic for you today. In fact, it's even fascinating for me. And we're going to talk about misconceptions in translation and interpreting. There are misconceptions in any field, and some of them throughout history you obviously know, like, the world stands on 4 elephants and a turtle, and maybe it does, I don't know. And the sun revolves around the earth, and the earth is the center of the universe, and what is it? There are 4 humors in the body. And what's the famous quote? I would rather err with Galen than be right with Harvey. I don't remember the exact discovery of Harvey, but he discovered something about blood circulation. That's a prelude. The point is, in any field, there are these little tiny, sometimes imperceptible misconceptions. These are big and huge misconceptions, but people fall for them because they're kind of treacherous in that they carry some truth or a lot of truth, but they're not necessarily true. I'll give you a few examples, right? I was watching actually Outlander yesterday, and a really smart, beautiful, clever woman, Claire, who's the main heroine, the doctor, my ideal wife, I'm sure you needed to know that, she says, I remembered the rule of 3. People survive for 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. Well, it's not necessarily true. For sure about water. I have fasted for 2.5 days, dry fasted, no water, no food. I was nowhere near dying. I have seen with my own 2 eyes people dry fast for 6 or 7 days, and I know 2 friends who did it for 10 days. And it's hard, it's tough, but you don't die. In fact, it's quite therapeutic. And I'm sure divers can hold their breath for longer than 3 minutes, and I'm pretty sure people have water fasted for longer than 3 weeks. In another field that I coach, running, there are all sorts of misconceptions. You propel yourself through pumping your arms or through the push-off. We're not going to discuss why it's not true, but you can take my word for it that it's not true, or not take my word for it. And in the field of love, not that I know anything about love, but there's an American expression or an English expression, time makes the heart grow fonder, and not necessarily true. Or my personal hero, the Russian Shakespeare, quote unquote, Alexander Pushkin, used to say, the less we love a lass or woman, the more she likes us in return. Also not necessarily true. There's maybe some truth in it. So, without further ado, let's look at such misconceptions in translation and interpreting. This is just something that I came up with off the cuff, 13. It's not necessarily that it's an exhaustive list, and I'm sure that I will be challenged to duels, exiled and banished and so forth from the translation community because I'm sort of going against the flow and against the current, but that's what I do best. Again, these things are not completely false, and we'll discuss them as we go. Okay, number 1, you need short segments and consecutive interpreting. In my experience, interpreting super short segments is very tough because it's going to be fragmentary and you don't have a lot of room to maneuver. Like, if I started speaking like this, interpreting is a skill, pause. The skill is not easy to acquire, pause. That's very choppy interpreting. The reason this misconception comes about is because if people are not trained, then yes, true, they need shorter segments. And many people have only worked with interpreters who are not necessarily trained, right? There is obviously some truth in it because everybody will have some sort of a limit, although I tend to think that your memory is infinite and limitless, and my own personal record is 33 minutes. It wasn't super packed with like technical details or factual information, but it was a 33-minute segment of speech that I just listened to and then interpreted. Okay, so that's misconception number 1. By the way, as I'm going through these, I don't know who said that or if anybody said that. Maybe Jesus said it, not that this is a religious text, but that faith comes through doubt. So you're totally welcome to doubt anything and everything I say. And that's in fact the whole purpose of this clip, is start analyzing critically what I'm saying and what people are saying. Because part of it is true, part of it is false. Let's go on. Slower speed and simultaneous. It is harder to interpret faster speeds. It is easier to interpret slower speeds. It is true to a degree. If somebody, to exaggerate completely and to use the absurdio ad infinitum technique, making something completely absurd, if somebody's speaking at 300 words per minute, okay, sure, maybe you can't keep up and I don't even know if it's technically possible to speak that fast.
Hey, everybody go. How to be better to get along. How to be better to buy, get to be better to buy 40. How to be better to buy $40.
But many colleagues that I have, even good colleagues, will just automatically go up to speakers and say, can you please speak slower than your normal speed? Well, why? They don't even know what their normal speed is. Maybe their normal speed is 120 words per minute, which is pretty slow. And in fact, if I were to speak extremely slow, like it's in slow motion, or like I had just taken something I shouldn't have, you would probably find that it's kind of hard to interpret me simultaneously because you can't get into the flow. So I never make this request, and I find it harder to interpret slightly faster speakers than slightly slower speakers. Plus, it's a professional point. Like, if you're a true master, we shouldn't necessarily be controlling the speaker's speed of interpretation. Sure, we can control some aspects, but that's another misconception that I think is at least partially a misconception. Next one. Ooh, I'm gonna get totally massacred for this. You should only interpret simultaneously into your native language. And this is sort of like the keystone principle of how it's done. Like, for example, at the UN, you go into your native language, be it Chinese, be it Russian, and so forth, or at many professional conferences. And there is definitely truth and a reason. Of course, the reason behind the rhyme, or the rhyme and reason, is that your native language is strongest, you can express yourself best, you're most erudite, you're most stylistically savvy in your native language, and it'll be the best. Okay, that is true. But that is only true provided that you have full, complete comprehension and the same level of comprehension in the source language that you're interpreting from as in your native language, right? Like, let's say, just for example, let's say I'm going between English and Spanish. Well, that's actually kind of an interesting example because it depends. There is no chance in the world, except very strange circumstances, that I would misunderstand something in English. But if a speaker is Cuban, if they're a very technical, like legal terminology, a fast-speaking prosecutor from Argentina or something like that, there's a much higher chance actually that I would misunderstand something in Spanish. So in that particular language pair, I would much prefer to go from English into Spanish because my Spanish is fluent enough that I know I can always express myself in Spanish. It might be slightly simpler, I might slightly lower the register, but it will be expressed. Whereas if I didn't understand it, tough luck, how can I ever interpret it? And I know that a lot of people will say, well, you should never be interpreting if your comprehension of the source language is not up to par. True, but there is nobody in the world whose comprehension of their non-native language is 100%. We can always find a speaker that will be super tough. So the answer is, it depends. If your degree of comprehension of both languages is much in the same or nearly the same, true, it's better to interpret into your native language. But I honestly think that a true professional can really and honestly go any way because they have the skill set, and if their level of command of the language is at least C1 or higher, look up the qualifications or the codifications if you don't know, but C1 is basically like a professional, if not native command of the language, they can go any way. Like, my pipe dream is to learn 10 languages and to simultaneously interpret in any direction. And my working languages are English, Russian, Spanish. I can go in any direction. So that's another misconception, I think. And in fact, again, I'm kind of beating the drum here or belaboring the point, but sometimes it's easier to go into your weaker language, quote unquote weaker, as long as you can express yourself fully in that language. Okay. Same deal, you should always translate into your native language. And again, I will probably get hung for this because this is like the canon of translation, that you should always translate into your native language. And again, there is a point to this because yes, if you translate into a language where your command of the language is stilted or it sounds like a translation or it's bad, it's no good, right? We do not need like a Google type rendition of the text or something which is incomprehensible. But first of all, do we care about papers and documents and what the birth certificate says, or do we actually care about the real life command of the language? I would say the second, and in fact there's a guy who used to be the president of the ATA American Translation Association, and he agreed with me on this. Like, it's your command of the language. It's whether or not you have native command, not whether or not it's your native language that matters. If I'm going into English in a written translation, there is no chance in hell or paradise or purgatory or any of the above that somebody is going to say this is a non-native translation. Okay, we can all make mistakes, but natives can also make mistakes, right? I've broken this rule many, many times. I translate equally from Russian into English, from English into Russian. Of course, my case is a little particular because I came here at 11, so it's different. But in fact, if anything, I translate better into English. But I have even translated into Spanish. But if I'm going into Spanish, I'm not so arrogant and stupid and whatever other word, impertinent and so forth, that I'm not going to get edited. I always get edited if I go into Spanish. But my very erudite Spanish-speaking friends have sometimes told me that, you know, Vladimir, you sometimes find very unique ways to express yourself, that you think outside the box because you're not necessarily like boxed into these rules of Spanish grammar, that sometimes your translations are phrased in ways that are correct, but we wouldn't even have thought of. I'll give you an example. We did a tale called The Fabulous Fable of Gosho the Goldfish that we translate into 13 languages. And I was the Russian to English and English into Spanish translator. But I had 4 native editors, one from Mexico, one from Guatemala, one from the Caribbean islands, and one from Cuba. So we made sure it was very neutral Spanish that would be understood by anybody and everybody. And when I translate songs or poems into Spanish, I usually get about 3-4 corrections per song, which is very darn good, I think. I'm proud. Anyway, let's move on. Quality and time and simultaneous. This is another big one. Like with time, you will lose quality. You can't go in simultaneous for a long time without losing quality. And this is why simultaneous interpreters switch every 15, 20, 30 minutes. Again, this has merit. It is to a degree true, and we do need our coffee breaks and so forth. But it is not completely true. I have gone for 2 or 3 hours without necessarily losing quality, and I've had cases where after 3 minutes I'm burnt out. It doesn't depend just on time. In fact, there are hidden factors. The 2 biggest hidden factors that I think people miss is, one, terminology. If you don't know the terminology, you'll be done after 1 minute. You'll be like, and you'll be lost and you'll be tired and whatever other pejorative synonym you want to use. And the other one is just, it's kind of a philosophical concept, the comfort of being there. Let me try and give you an example. There's probably something in your life that you're very comfortable with doing and something that you're very uncomfortable with doing. Like me, I'm very comfortable in cold water and ice water. I don't have to just run in for a polar plunge and run out. I can stay for an extended period of time because I've trained myself to be comfortable while being uncomfortable. Or one elite running coach once told me, even when you're running hard, you need to be comfortable. So elite runners have learned to tolerate the pain or the discomfort. I'm very uncomfortable, for example, if I have to, well, I'm a little uncomfortable in front of the camera, but not so uncomfortable that I have to run away. Maybe if I have to approach a Hollywood beauty out on the street, I'd be like, hello, goodbye. Maybe not, hopefully not, but I'm just giving you examples, right? So a lot of people just can't handle the simultaneous, and that's why they get tired. It is hard for them to tolerate the inflowing communication, the outflowing communication, all the hubbub and the confusion that goes with it. And the solution is a little more complex than I care to voice in this clip. There are different ways, but that's the reason. In any way that you can, make yourself comfortable with simultaneous. Maybe in a training, go for 2 hours. Maybe practice noisy settings. Maybe just sit there and in headphones and with a microphone and make sure that you're comfortable, or go into a booth, even better. So those are the 2 reasons. It's not all about time. Okay, let's move on. Oh yeah, this is interesting. Consecutive is easier than simultaneous because you have time to think. Nope, not necessarily. And here actually a lot of colleagues will agree with me. I was giving a very late night seminar. It wasn't late night for me, but it was late night for a colleague of mine whom I asked to take part. He was in Thailand or something. It was like 12 or 1 a.m. in the morning. And I said, will you just role play interpreting? He said, okay, as long as it's simultaneous. interesting, right? Like he was willing to do simultaneous after midnight, but not consecutive. And I've had other colleagues voice similar sentiments. Why? Because in consecutive, you have to stress your memory. Not necessarily stress, but you're taxing your memory. It's working. In simultaneous, not really. Comes out one ear and hopefully out the mouth, not out the other ear. But there is no really true memory training in simultaneous. Yes, it's like fast, brutal, bloody, whatever else. It's intense, but it's not taxing on your memory. Plus, not everybody is necessarily looking at you. Depends on the context. So there's not necessarily a quote-unquote easier mode of interpreting. They all have their challenges. Okay, let's move on. Interpreters should be aloof, detached, not fraternize with people, blah, blah, blah. True and false. I'm listening to a court training right now, which is very much punching up the point that we should not become the client's friend and so forth. That is true. In court settings, that is definitely true. And I've had my own bad experiences when I've crossed that boundary and it rebounded. Cute pun against me. It is not always necessarily true in other settings. Like if you are interpreting for a client, who's always your client, in fact, it is better to be friends with them. It is better to build rapport because you're on the same wavelength. That is actually why in very high-level diplomatic interpreting, people will interpret their president or their principal and they will go out of their native language, right? Like for example, let's say there's a diplomatic rendezvous or encounter between presidents of Russia and the US or whatever. So the Russian interpreter will go into English, which sort of goes against convention. Why? Because he knows his president's agenda and what the president wishes to say much better than the English speaker, even if it's a native English speaker. And his English is already so good that it's near native or native, right? So what was I talking about? Oh, yeah, and in that case, I actually know many cases when interpreters have become friends with the presidents or high-level politicians that they've interpreted for. And if it's a very friendly type setting or type context, why not? So it all depends on the context. It all depends on the setting. Let's move on. Interpreters should never improve the original. Again, this rule only really applies in court. And in court, it does have merit because you want to show the judge and you want to show everybody the level of maybe education that person has so they can adjust. You don't necessarily want to make them sound better, definitely not worse than they are. Although by accident, it usually happens to me anyways. I kind of raise the register in the education level, but it's true in court settings. It's not necessarily true anywhere else, and you're doing the person a favor, especially if they're your client, but even if they're not your client. All right, let's move on. This is another cute one. Do not look at the parties or the people. Sometimes I will do it to sort of facilitate or foster eye contact and communication between people, because what polite people usually tend to do is, since they're kind of speaking to the interpreter, they will look at the interpreter and they will shun the person they're actually talking to. So I will on purpose look down or look away so they will look at the person they're speaking to. That does have merit. But when I'm delivering my communication, like yes, there's even this school of interpreting that even when you're delivering, do not look at the person. I find this strange and even a bit rude. I will look at the person when I'm delivering the communication. You make your own choice. Whatever you feel like furthers the communication best, but it is not a hard-bound rule set in stone. Okay, let's move on. We're almost done. Idioms cannot be literally translated. Well, that's untrue. Let me give you a few examples. Like we have this one in Russian. I will marry you when the lobster whistles over the hill. The English equivalent would be when the fat lady sings. In fact, it's not lobster, it's crawfish, but lobster sounds better. But it makes sense. Okay, there's no reason not to say the fat lady sings, but what if you want to convey sort of like the regional taste of it? Or another one, терпение и труд, все перетрут. Patience and work reap the reward. So there you go, I just even poetically rendered it. And in fact, that's probably better than any equivalent in English than I can think of. So it is not true. It does not mean that you always have to do it, but it is not true. Next one. Jokes and puns cannot be interpreted. That's false. Anytime that you hear the phrase something can't be done, with very few exceptions, you probably know that you're talking to an amateur and not a true professional. Like, the 4-minute mile can't be broken. You can't swim in 5-degree water. You can't do this. You can't do that. That just means the person can't. It doesn't mean it can't be done. Jokes and puns can very well be interpreted. I don't have an example for you now. I probably need a speaker. All you have to do is think on your feet, have your mind in good shape, and achieve the same effect. I don't have an example for you. Maybe we'll do a separate clip later, but they definitely can be. Okay, you should always have a notepad. Again, some people will criticize me for it, but it all depends on the context. Do you want the lightness? Do you want to travel light? Or do you want the security of the notepad? Kind of like a little interesting tidbit to think about. All right, last one. An interpreter should always be punctual. You know, that's actually true. I wish it were April Fool's today. I would have said, haha, got you. But that's actually true. An interpreter should be punctual. I can think of no case where you shouldn't be. And in fact, I don't think this expression is Russian. Maybe it comes from French. But my grandpa taught this to me in Russian. Punctuality is the politeness of kings. Kind of a cute one. Have I been late to assignments? Yes. Is it ideal? No. But in most cases, my previously run sub 420 miles saved me from being late to assignments. It's a very useful skill, but of course it's better to just plan in advance. So there you have it, misconceptions in translation and interpreting. Maybe you have seen and heard your own. The point here is not necessarily to list out all possible misconceptions, but to make you think. There is usually never a black and white yes or no principle. Yes, sometimes, but very rarely. So be a thinking interpreter. Question things, break the rules, not always, not just to break the rules, but I have a whole article in my translation essays called The Rules of Rule Breaking. But first and foremost, analyze, be critical in your thinking, and decide for yourself what is true and what is not. There's no final authority in the world, not even me, on any topic. So be your own authority. That is the end of a hopefully useful clip. I need a sip of coffee, and I'll see you in the next clip. Ciao.